5. Saturnalia Games. Uncle Aquilla lived on the extreme edge of Aquilla. One reached his house down a narrow side street that turned off not far from the east gate, leaving behind the forum and the temples, and coming to a quiet angle of the old British earthworks, for Aquilla had been a British dun before it was a Roman city, where hawthorn and hazel still grew, and the shire woodland birds sometimes came. It was much like the other houses of Aquilla, timbered and red-roofed and comfortable, built round 3 sides of a tiny courtyard that was smoothly turfed and set about with imported roses and gum cistus growing in tall stone jars. But it had one peculiarity: a squat, square, flat-roofed tower rising from one corner. For Uncle Aquilla, having lived most of his life in the shadow of watchtowers from Memphis to Sigadunum, could not be comfortable without one. Here, in the shadow of his own watchtower, which he used as a study, he was very comfortable indeed, with his elderly wolf-hound Procyon and the history of siege warfare, which he had been writing for 10 years for company. By the dark end of October, Marcus had been added to the household. He was given a sleeping cell opening onto the courtyard colonnade, a lime-washed cell with a narrow cot piled with striped native blankets, a polished citronwood chest, a lamp on a bracket high against the wall. Save that the door was differently placed, it might have been his old quarters in the frontier fort, 7 days' march away, but most of his days were spent in the long atrium, the central room of the house, occasionally with Uncle Aquilla, but for the most part alone, save when Stephanos or Sastica looked in on him. He did not mind Stephanos, his uncle's old Greek body-slave, who now looked after him as well as his master, but Sastica, the cook, was another matter. She was a tall and gaunt old woman who could hit like a man, and frequently did when either of her fellow slaves annoyed her. But she treated Marcus as though he were a small sick child. She brought him little hot cakes when she had been baking, and warm milk, because she said he was too thin, and fussed and tyrannized over him until, for he was very afraid of kindness just then, he came near to hating her. That autumn was a bad time for Marcus. Feeling wretchedly ill for the first time in his life, almost always in pain, and face to face with the wreckage of everything he knew and cared about, he would wake in the dark mornings to hear the distant notes of cockcrow sounding from the transient camp just outside the city walls. And that did not make it any easier. He was homesick for the legions. He was desperately homesick for his own land, for now that they seemed lost to him, his own hills grew achingly dear, every detail of sight and scent and sound jewel vivid on his memory, the shivering silver of the olive woods when the mistral blew, the summer scent of thyme and rosemary, and little white cyclamen among the sun-warmed grass, the songs that the girls sang at vintage. And here in Britain, the wind moaned through the desolate woods, the skies wept, and wet gale-blown leaves pattered against the windows, and stuck there, making little pathetic shadows against the steamy glass. There had been wild weather often enough in his own country, but that had been the wild weather of home. Here was the wind and rain and wet leaves of exile. It would have gone less hardly with him if he had a companion of his own age. But he was the only young thing in the house, for even Procyon had gray hairs in his muzzle, and so he was shut in on himself, and though he did not know it, he was bitterly lonely. There was just one gleam of light for him in the darkness of that autumn. Not long after he came to Calleva, he had word from Crassius that henceforth the standard of the Gaulish Fourth would have its gilded laurel wreath to carry on parade. And a little later there came to Marcus himself the award of a military bracelet, which was a thing that he had never for an instant expected. This was not, as the various crowns were, purely a gallantry award. Rather, it was given for the same qualities which had earned for the Second Legion its titles, Pia Fidelis. Those titles, which were cut deep upon the heavy gold bracelet under the Capricorn badge of the Legion. From the day that it came to him, it was never off Marcus's wrist, and yet it meant rather less to him than the knowledge that his old cohort had won its first laurels. The days grew shorter, and the nights longer, and presently it was the night of the winter solstice, a fitting night for the dark turn of the year, Marcus thought. The inevitable wind was roaring up through the forest of Spinae, below the old British ramparts, driving with it squalls of sleet that spattered against the windows. In the atrium it was warm, for whatever the peculiarities of Uncle Aquila's house, the hypocaust worked perfectly, and for the pleasant look of it rather than for need, a fire of wild cherry logs on charcoal burned in the brazier hearth, filling the long room with faint aromatic scent. The light from the single bronze lamp, falling in a golden pool over the group before the hearth, scarcely touched the lime-washed walls, and left the far end of the room in crowding shadows, save for the glim light that always burned before the shrine of the household gods. Marcus lay propped on one elbow on his usual couch. Uncle Aquilla sat opposite to him in his great cross-legged chair, and beside them, outstretched on the warm tessellated floor. Procyon, the wolfhound. Uncle Aquilla was huge. That had been the first thing Marcus noticed about him, and he noticed it still. His joints appeared to be loosely strung together as if with wet leather. His head, with its bald, freckled top, and his bony, beautiful hands, were big even in proportion to the rest of him, and authority seemed to hang on him in easy and accustomed folds like his toga. Even allowing for their 20 years of difference in age, he was not in the least like Marcus's father, but Marcus had long ago ceased to think of him as like or unlike anyone. He was simply Uncle Aquilla. The evening meal was over, and old Stephanos had set out a draughts board on the table between Marcus and his uncle, and gone his way. In the lamplight, the ivory and ebony squares shone vividly white and black. Uncle Aquilla's men were already in place, but Marcus had been slower, because he was thinking of something else. He set down his last ivory man with a little click and said, "Ulpius was here this morning." "Ah, our fat physician," said Uncle Aquilla, his hand, which had been poised for an opening move, returning to the arm of his chair. "Had he anything to say worth the listening to?" "Only the usual things, that I must wait and wait." Suddenly Marcus exploded between misery and laughter. "He said I must have a little patience, and called me his dear young man, and wagged a scented finger under my nose. Fuck! He is like the white pulpy things one finds under stones." "So," agreed Uncle Aquilla. "Nonetheless, you must wait, there being no help for it." Marcus looked up from the board. "There's the rub. How long can I wait?" "Hmm?" said Uncle Aquilla. "I have been here 2 months now, and we have never spoken of the future. I have put it off from one visit of that pot-bellied leech to the next, because, I suppose, because I have never thought of any life but following the eagles, and I do not quite know how to begin." He smiled at his uncle apologetically. "But we must discuss it sometime." "Sometime, yes, but not now. No need to trouble about the future until the leg will carry you." "But Mithras knows how long that will be." "Do you not see, sir? I cannot go on foisting myself on you indefinitely." "Oh, my good lad, do not try to be such a fool," snapped Uncle Aquilla. But his eyes, under their jet of brow, were unexpectedly kindly. "I'm not a rich man, but neither am I so poor that I cannot afford to add a kinsman to my household. You do not get in my way, to be perfectly honest. I forget your existence rather more than half the time. You play a reasonably good game of draughts. Naturally, you will stay here, unless, of course," he leaned forward abruptly, "is it that you would rather go home?" "Home," Marcus echoed. Yes, I suppose you still have a home with that peculiarly foolish sister of mine. And with uncle by marriage, Tullus Lepidus? Marcus's head went up. His black brows twitched almost to meeting point, above a nose which looked suddenly as though there was a very bad smell under it. I'd sooner sit on Tiberside and beg my bread from the slum women when they come to fill their water pots. So? Uncle Aquilla nodded his huge head. And now, that being settled, shall we play? He made the opening move, and Marcus answered it. For a while, they played in silence. The lamplit room was a shell of quiet, amid the wild sea roaring of the wind. The small saffron flames whispered in the brazier, and a burned cherry log collapsed with a tinsely rustle into the red hollow of the charcoal. Every few moments there would be a little clear click as Marcus or his uncle moved a piece on the board. But Marcus did not really hear the small, peaceful sounds, nor see the man opposite, for he was thinking of things that he had been trying not to think of all day. It was the 24th evening of December, the eve of the winter solstice, the eve of the birth of Mithras, and quite soon now, in camps and forts, wherever the eagles flew, men would be gathering to his worship. In the outposts and the little frontier forts, the gatherings would be mere handfuls, but in the great legionary stations there would be full caves of 100 men. Last year, at Isca, he had been one of them, newly initiated at the bull slaying, the brand of the Raven degree, still raw between his brows. He ached with the longing for last year to be given back to him, for the old life and the comradeship to be given back to him. He moved an ivory man a little blindly, seeing not the black and white dazzle of the board before his eyes, but that gathering of a year ago, filing out by the Praetorian gate and downhill to the cave. He could see the crest of the centurion in front of him, upreared blackly against the pulsing fires of Orion. He remembered the waiting darkness of the cave. Then, as the trumpets sounded from the distant ramparts for the third watch of the night, the sudden glory of candles that sank and turned blue, and sprang up again. The reborn light of Mithras in the dark of the year. A great gust of wind swooped against the house like a wild thing striving to batter its way in. The lamplight jumped and fluttered, sending shadows racing across the checkered board, and the ghosts of last year were once more a year away. Marcus looked up and said, as much for the sake of shutting out his own thoughts as for anything else, "I wonder what possessed you to settle here in Britain, Uncle Aquilla, when you could have gone home." Uncle Aquilla moved his piece with meticulous care before he answered with another question. "It seems very odd to you that anyone free to go home should choose to strike his roots in this barbarous country?" On a night like this, said Marcus, it seems odd, almost past believing. I had nothing to take me back, said the other, simply. Most of my service years were spent here, though it was in Judea that my time fell due for parting with the eagles. What have I to do with the South? Few memories, very few. I was a young man when first I saw the white cliffs of Dubries above the transport galley's prow. Far more memories in the north. Your move. Marcus moved an ivory man to the next square, and his uncle shifted his own piece. If I settled in the south, I should miss the skies. Ever noticed how changeful British skies are? I have made friends here, a few. The only woman I ever cared a denarius for lies buried at Cleveland. Marcus looked up quickly. I never knew. Why should you? But I was not always old Uncle Aquilla with a bald head. No, of course not. What was she like? Very pretty. She was the daughter of my old camp commandant, who had a face like a camel, but she was very pretty, with a lot of soft brown hair. 18 when she died. I was 22. Marcus said nothing. There seemed nothing to say. But Uncle Aquilla, seeing the look on his face, gave a deep chuckle. No, you have it all quite wrong. I'm a very selfish old man, perfectly well content with things as they are. And then, after a pause, he harked back to an earlier point in their discussion. I killed my first boar in Silurian territory. I have sworn the blood brotherhood with a painted tribesman up beyond where Hadrian's wall stands now. I've a dog buried at Lugavalium. Her name was Margarita. I have loved a girl at Cleveland. I have marched the eagles from end to end of Britain in worse weather than this. Those are the things apt to strike a man's roots for him. Marcus said, after a moment, I think I began to understand. Good. Your move. But after they had played a few more moves in silence, Uncle Aquilla looked up again, the fine wrinkles deepening at the corners of his eyes. What an autumnal mood we have wandered into. We need livening up, you and I. What do you suggest? Marcus returned the smile. I suggest the Saturnalia games tomorrow. We may not be able to compete quite on equal terms with the Colosseum here at Caliva, but a wild beast show, a sham fight with perhaps a little bloodletting, we will certainly go. And they went. Marcus traveling in a litter for all the world, as he remarked disgustedly, like a magistrate or a fine lady. They arrived early, but by the time they were settled on one of the cushioned benches, reserved for the magistrates and their families, Uncle Aquilla was a magistrate, though he had not come in a litter. The amphitheater just outside the east gate was already filling up with eager spectators. The wind had died down, but the air struck cold, with a clear, chill tang to it that Marcus sniffed eagerly while he pulled the folds of his old military cloak more closely round him. After being so long within four walls, the sanded space of the arena seemed very wide, a great emptiness within the encircling banks up which the crowded benches rose tier on tier. Whatever else of Rome the British had not taken up, they seemed to have taken to the games with a vengeance, Marcus thought, looking about him at the crowded benches were townsfolk and tribesmen with their womenfolk and children, jostled and shoved and shouted after the best places. There was a fair sprinkling of legionaries from the transient camp, and Marcus's quick glance picked out a bored young tribune, sitting with several British lads, all pretending to be equally Roman and equally bored. He remembered Colosseum crowds, chattering, shouting, quarreling, laying bets, and eating sticky sweets. The British took their pleasures a little less loudly, to be sure, but on almost every face was the same eager, almost greedy look that the faces of the Colosseum crowds had worn. A small disturbance near him drew Marcus's attention to the arrival of a family who were just entering their places on the magistrates' benches a little to his right. A British family of the ultra-Roman kind, a large, good-natured looking man running too fat, as men do who have been bred to a hard life, and take to living soft instead. A woman with a fair and rather foolish face, pricked out in what had been the height of fashion in Rome 2 years ago, and very cold she must be, Marcus thought, in the thin mantle, and a girl of perhaps 12 or 13, with a sharply pointed face that seemed all golden eyes in the shadow of her dark hood. The stout man and Uncle Aquilla saluted each other across the heads between, and the woman bowed. All Rome was in that bow, but the girl's eyes were fixed on the arena with a kind of horrified expectancy. When the newcomers were settled in their places, Marcus touched his uncle's wrist, and cocked an inquiring eyebrow. A fellow magistrate of mine, Caeso by name, and his wife, Valeria, Uncle Aquilla said. Incidentally, they are our next-door neighbors. Are they so? But the little maiden, she is no bud of their branch, surely. But he got no answer to his question then, for at that moment a great crashing of cymbals and a fanfare of trumpets announced that the games were about to begin. All round the crowded circus there was a sudden quietness and a craning forward. Again the trumpets sounded. The double doors at the far side were flung open, and out from their underground lodgments a double file of gladiators came marching into the arena, each carrying the weapons he would use later in the show. Shout on shout greeted their appearance. For a small colonial circus, they seemed rather a good lot, Marcus thought, watching them as they paraded around the arena. Too good, maybe, though probably they were all slaves. Marcus was something of a heretic where the games were concerned. He liked well enough to see a wild beast show, or a sham fight, if it were well done. But to put up men, even slaves, to fight to the death for a crowd's amusement, seemed to him a waste. The men had halted now before the magistrates' benches, and in a few moments that they stood there, Marcus's whole attention was caught by one of them, a sword and buckler man of about his own age. He was rather short for a Briton, but powerful. His russet brown hair, flung back by the savage pride with which he carried his head, showed the clipped ear that branded him for a slave. Seemingly, he had been taken in war, for his breast and shoulders he was stripped to the waist, where tattooed with blue warrior patterns. But it was none of these things that Marcus saw, only the look in the wide-set gray eyes that strained back at him out of the gladiator's young, sullen face. "This man is afraid," said something deep in Marcus. Afraid, and his own stomach cringed within him. A score of weapons flashed in the wintry light, as they were tossed up with a shout and caught again, and the gladiators wheeled and strode on down the wide curve that led back to their starting point. But the look that he had seen in the young swordsman's eyes remained with Marcus. The first item on the program was a fight between wolves and a brown bear. The bear did not want to fight, and was driven into battle by the long curling whiplashes of the attendants. Presently, amid a great shouting from the onlookers, it was killed. Its body was dragged away, and with it the bodies of 2 wolves it had slain. The others were decoyed back into their wheeled cage for another time, and attendants spread fresh sand over the blood in the arena. Marcus glanced, without quite knowing why, at the girl in the dark hood, and saw her sitting as though frozen, her eyes wide and blank with horror in an ashy face. Still oddly shaken by that queer moment of contact with the young gladiator, who was so very much afraid, he was filled with a sudden unreasoning anger against Kaizo and his wife for bringing the little maiden to see a thing like this, against all games and all mobs who came to watch them with their tongues hanging out for horrors, even against the bear for being killed. The next item was a sham fight, with a little damage done save a few flesh wounds. In the back of beyond, circus masters could not afford to be wasteful with their gladiators. Then a boxing match, in which the heavy cestus round the fighters' hands drew considerably more blood than the swords had done. A pause came, in which the arena was once again cleaned up and freshly sanded, and then a long gasp of expectancy ran through the crowd, and even the bored young tribune sat up and began to take some notice as, with another blare of trumpets, the double door swung wide once more, and two figures stepped out side by side into the huge emptiness of the arena. Here was the real thing, a fight to the death. At first sight, the two would seem to be unequally armed, for while one carried sword and buckler, the other, a slight dark man, with something of the Greek in his face and build, carried only a three-pronged spear, and had over his shoulder a many-folded net, weighted with small discs of lead. But in truth, as Marcus knew only too well, the odds were all in favor of the man with the net, the fisher, as he was called, and he saw with an odd sinking of the heart that the other was a young swordsman who was afraid. Never did like the net, Uncle Aquilla was grumbling. Not a clean fight, no. A few moments earlier, Marcus had known that his damaged leg was beginning to cramp horribly. He had been shifting and shifting again, trying to ease the pain without catching his uncle's notice. But now, as the two men crossed to the center of the arena, he had forgotten about it. The roar which greeted the pair of fighters had fallen to a breathless hush. In the center of the arena, the two men were being placed by the captain of the gladiators, placed with exquisite care, 10 paces apart, with no advantage of light or wind allowed to either. The thing was quickly and competently done, and the captain stepped back to the barriers. For what seemed a long time, neither of the two moved. Moment followed moment, and still they remained motionless, the center of all that great circle of staring faces. Then, very slowly, the swordsman began to move. Never taking his eyes from his adversary, he slipped one foot in front of the other, crouching a little, covering his body with the round buckler. Inch by inch he crept forward, every muscle tense to spring. When the time came, the fisher stood as still as ever, poised on the balls of his feet, the trident in his left hand, his right lost in the folds of the net. Just beyond reach of the net, the swordsman checked for a long, agonizing moment, and then sprang in. His attack was so swift that the flung net flew harmlessly over his head, and the fisher leapt back and sideways to avoid his thrust, and whirled about and ran for his life, gathering his net for another cast as he ran, with the young swordsman hard behind him. Half round the arena they sped, running low. The swordsman had not the other's length and lightness of build, but he ran as a hunter runs. Perhaps he had run down deer on the hunting trail before ever his ear was clipped, and he was gaining on his quarry now. The two came flying round the curve of the barrier towards the magistrates' benches, and just abreast of them the fisher whirled about and flung once more. The net whipped out like a dark flame. It licked round the running swordsman, so intent on his chase that he had forgotten to guard for it. The weight carried the deadly folds across and across again, and a howl burst from the crowd as he crashed headlong and rolled over, helplessly meshed as a fly in a spider's web. Marcus wrenched forward. His breath caught in his throat. The swordsman was lying just below him, so near that they could have spoken to each other in an undertone. The fisher was standing over his fallen antagonist, with the trident poised to strike, a little smile on his face, though his breath whistled through widened nostrils as he looked about him for the bidding of the crowd. The fallen man made as though to raise his hampered arm in the signal by which a vanquished gladiator might appeal to the crowd for mercy, then let it drop back proudly to his side. Through the fold of the net across his face, he looked up straight into Marcus's eyes, a look as direct and intimate as though they had been the only two people in all that great amphitheater. Marcus was up and standing with one hand on the barrier rail to steady himself, while with the other he made the sign for mercy. Again and again he made it, with a blazing vehemence, with every atom of willpower that was in him, his glance thrusting like a challenge along the crowded tiers of benches where already the thumbs were beginning to turn down. This mob, this unutterably stupid, blood-greedy mob that must somehow be swung over into foregoing the blood it wanted. His gorge rose against them, and there was an extraordinary sense of battle in him that could not have been more vivid had he been standing over the fallen gladiator, sword in hand. "Thumbs up! Thumbs up, you fools!" He had been aware from the first of Uncle Aquila's great thumb pointing skyward beside him. Suddenly he was aware of a few others echoing the gesture, and then a few more. For a long, long moment the swordsman's fate still hung in the balance, and then as the thumb after thumb went up, the fisher slowly lowered his trident, and with a little mocking bow stepped back. Marcus drew a shuddering breath and relaxed into a flood of pain from his cramped leg, as an attendant came forward to disentangle the swordsman and aid him to his feet. He did not look at the young gladiator again. This moment was shame for him, and Marcus felt that he had no right to witness it. That evening, over the usual game of draughts, Marcus asked his uncle, "What will become of that lad now?" Uncle Aquilla moved an ebony piece after due consideration. "The young fool of a swordsman? He will be sold in all likelihood. The crowd do not pay to see a man fight when once he has been down and at their mercy." "That is what I have been thinking," Marcus said. He looked up from making his own move. "How do prices run in these parts? Would 1,500 sesterces buy him?" "Very probably. Why?" "Because I have that much left of my pay, and a parting thank-offering that I had from Tullus Lepidus. There was not much to spend it on in Isca Dunanorium." Uncle Aquila's brows cocked inquiringly. "Are you suggesting buying him yourself? Would you give him house room?" "I expect so," said Uncle Aquila, "though I am somewhat at a loss to understand why you should wish to keep a tame gladiator. Why not try a wolf instead?" Marcus laughed. "It is not so much a tame gladiator as a body slave that I need. I cannot go on overworking poor old Stephanos forever." Uncle Aquilla leaned across the checkered board. "And what makes you think that an ex-gladiator would make you a suitable body slave?" "To speak truth, I had not thought about it," Marcus said. "How do you advise me to set about buying him?" "Send down to the circus slave master and offer a half of what you expect to pay, and sleep with a knife under your pillow thereafter," said Uncle Aquilla.